Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that happened in the year of our Lord 1347, in a castle whose name has been swallowed by time, in a dungeon that nobody remembers anymore. A place where a man named Edmund was expected to stay locked behind 3-inch thick oak doors, remain silent despite the weight of his own breathing, survive on bread that tasted like regret mixed with sawdust, and somehow, despite all of this, maintained the strength to accept his fate. And then he did something that nobody thought was possible. Before we settle into this story together, I want you to get comfortable. Wherever you are right now, whether that's on a bed, on a couch, or on the floor with your head on something soft, I need you to take a moment. Take a breath. The kind of breath you take when you're about to fall asleep. Slow and deep. The kind that reminds your body that it's allowed to let go. Good. Keep breathing like that. Dim your lights if they're still on. If you're in darkness already, that's perfect. Close your eyes if you want to, or keep them open with a soft focus, looking at nothing in particular. The kind of nothing that exists just behind your eyelids. What you're about to hear is a story about escape, but not the kind of escape you might expect. It's not about action movies or dramatic chases through corridors.
It's quieter than that. It's slower. It's the kind of escape that happens in the mind before it happens in the body. And sometimes it doesn't happen in the body at all. It happens in the way you accept the world around you, and in doing so, you somehow transcend it. Edmund lived in a time when castles were the permanent structures of the world, rising from the landscape like mountains made of stone and intention. These were not buildings designed to be comfortable. They were designed to be imposing. They were designed to be impossible to leave. The castle where Edmund was imprisoned was called Thornwick, though by the time Edmund arrived there, almost nobody called it by that name anymore.
The people who lived around it called it the Stone Place or the Dark Building, or sometimes, if they were being particularly poetic after too much ale, they called it the place where hope goes to thin out like old cloth. The castle had been built 150 years before Edmund was born, constructed with a purpose that was very clear: to hold things. To hold prisoners, yes, but also to hold power, to hold authority, to hold the very idea that some people belonged inside these walls and some people belonged outside, and the two groups would never touch. The dungeon where Edmund spent his days was 4 levels below the ground floor of the castle, which meant it was 4 levels below the level that was already below the level where the regular people lived. This is a detail that matters, though you might not know why yet. The descent was real, physically real. A man named Gilbert, who was in charge of bringing prisoners down to their cells, used to say that every step down the stone staircase felt like stepping backwards through time. When you reached the bottom, you weren't just in a different part of the building, you were in a different part of history. You were in an older world, a world that didn't have windows, or clocks, or the soft sound of wind moving through courtyards. You had only stone and dampness and the sound of water that came from somewhere and went to somewhere else. But mostly, you had silence that pressed against your ears like a physical thing. Now, before we go deeper into Edmund's story, I want you to imagine something for me. Not with effort, not with the kind of imagination that makes you tense your face and think hard. Just let it float into your mind the way a thought comes to you when you're almost asleep. Imagine a dungeon. Not from a movie, though you might use that as a starting point. Imagine instead the kind of dungeon that was built to be forgotten. The kind where the architects didn't bother with perfect symmetry because nobody important was ever going to see it. The walls are made of stone, but not perfect stone. This stone is irregular. Some of it came from one quarry and some from another, from decades before, from when the castle's founder had already changed his mind about what he wanted. The stones are fitted together with mortar, and that mortar has been drying for 150 years. It is not the same mortar it once was. It is older, more fragile, more prone to crumbling if you pressed your hands against it in just the right way. The floor of the dungeon is also stone, but it is wet. Not dripping wet, not dramatically wet, but persistently wet, with the kind of moisture that comes from being below the water table, from having earth pressed down on you from all sides. There are places where the water has collected and created puddles, small mirrors of blackness that reflect nothing because there is so little light to reflect. The air down there smells like you might expect it to smell. It smells like old water, like minerals, like the particular staleness that comes when air has been breathed in and out by human lungs for days without being refreshed. There is also the smell of human waste, though the dungeon did have a system for dealing with that. It wasn't a good system.
It was a system that worked, insofar as it prevented disease from completely overwhelming everyone at once, but it was not a pleasant system. It was a system designed by people who had decided that unpleasantness was an acceptable price for not having to think about the people who lived below. Edmund had been in the dungeon of Thornwick Castle for 7 months. 7 months is not a short time. 7 months is long enough for the human mind to adapt to almost any circumstance. It is long enough to forget the exact shade of blue that the sky had been on the day you were arrested. It is long enough to forget the sound of your wife's laugh, or at least to remember it incorrectly, substituting it with something duller, something more worn. 7 months of the same stone walls, the same damp air, the same routine of waking and eating and waiting and sleeping had carved out a new shape in Edmund's mind, the way water carves a path through stone, not through force, but through time and gentle persistence. Let me tell you about Edmund, because he is the heart of this story, though his heart at this moment is very tired. Edmund was a man of 32 years when he came to the dungeon. He had been a carpenter before, or more precisely, a man who knew how to work with wood in a way that was useful and sometimes beautiful. He had made doors and tables and window frames. He had made a coffin once, a commission for a wealthy merchant's wife, and he had spent 3 weeks on the carving, working small vines and flowers into the wooden panels, which seemed like a strange use of time given that nobody but worms were going to see it. But Edmund had done it anyway, because he believed that even things that were going to be buried deserved to be made with care. He had a wife named Margaret and 2 children, and a small house on the edge of the town where the castle stood. He had what you might call an ordinary life, if such a thing exists. He had the kind of life where you wake up and do your work and come home and eat and sleep, and you think about your death sometimes, but not constantly, and you believe that this is how it will continue until it doesn't, which is the belief that almost everyone has until the moment it proves false. What changed Edmund's life was a single act of bad luck combined with proximity to powerful people. A nobleman named Sir Geoffrey had commissioned Edmund to build new doors for one of the castle's storage rooms. These doors were supposed to be magnificent. Sir Geoffrey had specific ideas about how they should look. He wanted them to incorporate the family crest, and he wanted them to be made from oak that had been aged for exactly 15 years, no more, no less. The construction took Edmund 6 weeks. He worked carefully. He worked with precision. And when he was finished, the doors were, if he was being honest with himself, the finest thing he had ever made. They were beautiful. They caught the light in ways that made the carved details seem almost alive. He was proud of them in a quiet way, the way a parent is proud of a child who has turned out to be kind and intelligent without having been asked to be those things. Sir Geoffrey looked at the doors for approximately 30 seconds, and then he said they were wrong. The crest was facing the wrong direction. The measurement of the carved frame was 2 inches smaller than he had specified. The wood was too light in color. He had wanted it darker. And more than that, he said, he believed that Edmund had deliberately done these things because Edmund resented him, because Edmund harbored secret thoughts against the nobility, because Edmund was the kind of craftsman who let his own ideas override the reasonable requests of his superiors. But the truth became irrelevant at a particular moment when Sir Geoffrey was angry, and Edmund, trying to defend his work, said something that could be interpreted as arguing.
and arguing with a nobleman was a kind of insolence that the law of the time took very seriously. The trial, if you could call it that, took 3 hours. Edmund was not allowed to bring witnesses. The accusation was brought by Sir Geoffrey himself, who was a man of considerable reputation and standing. Edmund's side of the story was heard, but it was heard the way a minor complaint is heard by someone who was already in the process of leaving the room.
The judge, a man named Lord Thorne, who had much invested in maintaining good relations with the local nobility, found Edmund guilty of insolence, disrespect, and harboring thoughts of sedition. Sedition was a serious charge. Sedition meant that Edmund had been thinking dangerous thoughts about the social order. Sedition meant that Edmund had allowed himself to believe that his judgment might be equal to that of a nobleman. For this crime, Edmund was sentenced to 5 years in the dungeon of Thornwick Castle. 7 months in, he had 4 years and 5 months to go. You are Edmund. You wake. The waking is not sudden.
There are no sounds to startle you awake in the dungeon, no birds outside a window, no cock crow, no voices of servants beginning their day. Your waking is slow, a gradual accumulation of consciousness that happens because your body has been asleep long enough and needs to move. You open your eyes, but the darkness you see is not much different from the darkness you saw with your eyes closed. This is a detail that matters more than you might think. The human eye needs light to function, and without light it becomes useless, and without usefulness, the eye stops trying. After 7 months, Edmund's eyes had stopped trying. They had adjusted to such a degree that the difference between closed and open had become almost imperceptible.
Your cell is a space that is 8 feet long and 6 feet wide. It is just large enough that you can lie down and not touch both the far wall and the iron bars that separate you from the corridor. It is just small enough that you cannot stand and stretch without becoming aware of your own confinement in a way that is visceral and unavoidable. There is a bench made of stone built into the wall. There is a bucket in the corner made of wood, which serves as your toilet. There is a pile of straw in another corner, covered with a thin blanket made of burlap, which is where you sleep. The blanket smells like mold.
After 7 months, you no longer notice this, but if you were to notice it, you would say that the smell is like every basement in every house that has ever been too damp, concentrated and made worse by the fact that your face is very close to it when you sleep. You sit up slowly. Your back makes a sound. It is a small sound, a series of cracks that begin at your lower spine and work their way upward. You have learned to listen to your body in the way that a sailor learns to listen to his ship. The sounds tell you about deterioration, about the wearing away of things that cannot be repaired here. Your knees hurt when you stand.
They hurt in the morning and then hurt less as the day goes on, which suggests that the problem is not permanent, but rather cyclical, a kind of daily damage that your body repairs in the night, though the repairs are never quite complete. By the time the damage appears again the next morning, your body is already further behind than it was the day before. The floor is cold. You have learned this cold. It is a specific temperature, just above freezing, the kind of cold that makes you think of stone and moisture and deep places under the earth. You stand and you wait for the steadiness to return to your legs. They shake for a moment, not from fear, just from disuse.
You have not walked more than the few steps of your cell in the past 7 months. The muscles in your legs have become ornamental. They are there, but they are not as efficient as they once were. You think about this while you stand, your feet on the cold stone, and you notice that you are thinking about it, and you try to stop thinking about it, because the thinking about degradation is its own form of degradation. There is a window in your cell, not a window in the way you would understand a window, not an opening to the outside world. It is a narrow opening in the wall that is maybe 2 inches wide and 8 inches tall, cut into the stone and left open. You do not know where it leads. You have never heard anything come through it. No birds, no insects, no sound of the outside world. You have come to believe that it is an accident, that it is a gap left by careless stoneworking 100 years ago, and that it has been left open because nobody cares enough about the dungeon to bother closing it. Sometimes you stand in front of it and listen very carefully to see if you can hear anything. You have never heard anything, but sometimes, if you place your hand very close to it, you can feel the faintest movement of air. It is not much, it is barely perceptible, but it is air that comes from somewhere outside this room, and this knowledge, though it does not change anything, somehow matters. Gilbert arrives with your breakfast. You can hear his footsteps before you see him, a heavy, deliberate walking that comes down the corridor. Gilbert is the man who brings food to the prisoners. There are 12 cells in this dungeon, and 10 of them are occupied. Edmund does not know the names of the men in the other cells. He knows their sounds. He knows the sound of a man in the cell 3 doors down who coughs every morning, a thick, wet cough that suggests his lungs are slowly filling with something. He knows the sound of a man 2 cells to the left who talks to himself, rehearsing conversations he will never have, arguing with people he will never see again.
He knows the sound of a man in the cell across the corridor who says nothing at all, who makes no sound in the morning, no sound at the midday meal, no sound in the evening except for the regular rhythm of breathing, as if even sound was a luxury that man had decided he could not afford. Gilbert is a man of 60 years. He has been bringing food to prisoners for 30 of those years. He has seen men arrive and leave, some by being released, most by being executed, and a few by simply dying in their cells, which was a third option that the dungeon allowed for. Gilbert is not a cruel man. He is not a kind man. He is a man who has a job, and he does his job in the most efficient way possible, which means he does not talk to the prisoners, does not ask them questions, does not engage with them as human beings. He brings food. He brings water. He removes the buckets that are used for the purpose of waste. He exists in a state of separation from the men in the cells. If you were to ask him if he thought about the prisoners after he left the dungeon, he would tell you that he did not, and he would be telling the truth. He did not think about them. He thought about his own life, his own small house, his own aging wife, his own accumulation of years that he could feel adding up in his knees and his back and his eyes.
The prisoners were not part of his thinking. They were part of his routine, which is different. Gilbert reaches your cell, and he passes a wooden bowl through the bars. The bowl contains porridge. It is the same porridge that is brought every morning. It is made from oats and water, and it has been seasoned with salt, which is the only seasoning available to prisoners. The oats have been cooked until they are very soft, almost to the point of dissolution, as if they have surrendered their form in the face of heat and time. You take the bowl, and your hands, which are cold, register the warmth of it. This is one of the small things that you look forward to every morning. Not the food itself. The food is not good.
But the fact that something warm exists, and that warmth is in your hands, and your hands are part of your body, and your body feels the warmth, and you know that you are still connected to the capacity to feel. Gilbert passes a cup of water. The water comes from a well that is somewhere in the castle. It is not bad water. It is clean enough. 7 months ago, you might have thought about whether the water was cold or room temperature. Now you do not think about such things. You drink the water, and you are grateful that you have water to drink. Gilbert moves down the corridor to the next cell. You can hear him doing the same thing for the next man. You eat your porridge slowly. There is no rush.
There is all the time in the world, and there is no time at all, because the hours of the dungeon do not progress the way hours progress on the outside. An hour in the dungeon is longer than an hour outside. This is something you have come to understand. The hours have expanded, stretched out, become thin and wide, so that each one feels like it contains a vast amount of time. In this way, 7 months feels like it has been much longer.
In this way, 4 years and 5 months stretches out into something so vast that you cannot contemplate it. So you don't. You contemplate the spoon in your hand. You contemplate the taste of salt on your tongue. You contemplate the temperature of the porridge.
The porridge is warm, and it is slightly sweet, which means that whoever made it today added a small amount of honey. You do not know why this happens sometimes and not others. You have considered that there might be a pattern. You have tried to find the pattern. You have kept a mental record of which days had honey and which did not, and you have tried to match it to something. Days of the week? No. The weather outside? You do not know the weather. Some cycle of kitchen management? Perhaps. But the truth is that you will never know the answer, and so you have decided to simply accept the honey when it comes, as a gift, as a small thing that happens sometimes, for reasons unknown.
This is a useful skill to develop in a dungeon, the skill of accepting randomness, of understanding that some things happen and they do not have to make sense, and they do not have to have reasons that you can access. You finish the porridge. You drink the water. You place the bowl and cup on the floor near the bars. In a little while, Gilbert will come back and take them. The taking will be more efficient than the giving, because he will reach through the bars, grab the bowl and cup, and move to the next cell, and he will not wait for you to talk to him, because he knows you will not. Or rather, he assumes you will not. In 7 months, you have not said a single word to Gilbert. It is not that you have been specifically silent as some kind of protest. It is more that you have found that talking requires a kind of energy that you do not have. It requires you to believe that your words matter, that they will be heard as meaningful, that the person you are talking to cares about anything you might say, and so you have simply stopped trying. There is a rat. You have seen this rat. You do not know if it is the same rat each time, or if there are multiple rats. You have named this rat, or these rats, Margaret, after your wife, though you are not sure why you chose that name for a rat, and you do not think your wife would appreciate the comparison. Margaret appears sometimes.
She appears in the morning, and she appears in the afternoon, and sometimes she appears in the middle of the night, when you hear her moving through the straw. She is not large as rats go. She is perhaps the size of a sparrow, and she moves with a kind of purpose, as if she has a specific place to be. You have tried to befriend her. You have left small pieces of bread in the corners of your cell. She eats the bread sometimes, though you cannot be sure she is the one eating it. But you have convinced yourself that she is, because believing that there is a specific rat that has learned to trust you in some small way is comforting, in the way that many small comforts have become precious to you.
The morning passes, and there is nothing to distinguish it from any other morning. You sit on the stone bench. You think. You do not think with the kind of concentrated attention that you once used for your work. You think in a passive way. Thoughts come to you, and you let them come, and then you let them go. You think about your wife. You think about the exact sound of her voice, and you realize, again, that you have forgotten the exact sound. You think about your children. You have 2 children, both of them young, both of them probably forgetting what you look like. Your son was 8 years old when you were arrested. Your daughter was 5. They are older now. They are growing up without you, and you are growing older without them. And this is something that happens in the world, but knowing it happens does not make it hurt less. You think about your house. You think about the workshop where you made doors and tables. You think about whether anyone has taken that work over, whether someone else is making doors now, and people are calling them by Edmund's doors, not knowing that Edmund is not the one making them anymore. You think about the doors you made for Sir Geoffrey. You think about whether he had them burned, or whether he just covered them up, or whether he had them installed and looked at them with resentment every time he cast them.
You wonder if he has ever felt even a moment of doubt about having you arrested. You think probably not. You think that people like Sir Geoffrey are built in such a way that doubt cannot take root in them. Now, Edmund had not always been in a dungeon. This is an important thing to remember.
And even though he is now in a place where tools are not allowed, where the only things he is given are things that cannot be weaponized or used to create, there is still something in his mind that remembers the way his hands used to move. In his cell there is very little. There is the bench, the bucket, the blanket, the straw. There is nothing that he could use to make anything. There is nothing that would allow him to create. And yet creation is something that does not leave a man completely. It lives in the muscles. It lives in the memory of the hands. And so Edmund has found himself creating with the only materials available to him. He has taken to arranging things.
Very small rearrangements, almost imperceptible to anyone but himself. He has taken pieces of straw and placed them in patterns on the floor. Not decorative patterns, though they are sometimes that, but patterns that have meaning. He has arranged straw to recreate a map of his house, his workshop, the layout of the streets he used to walk. He has done this from memory, and the memory has become unreliable over time, so the map is not accurate, but it is accurate enough to him. He arranges the straw, and he looks at it, and he thinks about walking from one room to the next.
He closes his eyes and tries to move through the map in his mind, and sometimes he can feel his feet on the floorboards, and sometimes he can hear the creak of the wood, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it does not. He has also taken to scratching marks on the wall, not big, dramatic marks, small marks, made with a tiny piece of stone that he found in the corner of his cell, perhaps fallen from the wall years before, perhaps left there deliberately by a previous prisoner. With this stone, he scratches the wall. He has created a calendar. Every day, he makes a mark.
7 months is approximately 210 days, so there are approximately 210 marks on the wall, though he has lost count, and some days he makes 2 marks by mistake, and some days he forgets to make a mark at all. But the marks are there, and they are visible, and they tell the story of time passing in a way that is concrete and visual. He has started to use these marks for something else too. He has started to scratch patterns into the wall, lines that form shapes. Nothing revolutionary, nothing that would look like anything to anyone else, but to Edmund they look like the decorative flourishes he used to carve into wooden doors.
He scratches them very lightly, so that they are almost not there, so that they do not constitute any kind of damage to the castle's property, so that they are almost like ghosts of the things he used to make. He does this work very slowly, a few scratches each day. He does not want to finish it, because finishing it would mean that the work was done, and once the work was done, there would be nothing left to do. And so he prolongs it, stretches it out, makes each scratch deliberate and intentional. He thinks about his tools often. This is the kind of thinking that is painful, but it is also necessary. He thinks about his hammer. It was a good hammer, well balanced, with a wooden handle that had been worn smooth by years of use.
His hand fit perfectly into it, the way a hand fits into something that has been made for it. He thinks about his saw. The saw had to be used with a specific rhythm, a push and pull that became meditative once you understood it. He thinks about his chisels, which ranged in size from very small to very large, and each one had a specific purpose, though a good carpenter learned how to use a tool for a purpose other than the one it was designed for, because that was part of the mastery. He thinks about his workbench, which had been made by his father, and which had survived decades of use because it had been made with care, and because it had been maintained, and because nobody had tried to force it to do something it was not designed to do.
He does not know what has happened to these tools. In the chaos of his arrest and trial and sentencing, there had been no time to consider what would happen to his workshop. His wife Margaret would have been dealing with the sudden loss of income, the sudden loss of husbandness, the sudden need to figure out how to live on her own with 2 children. The tools would have been low on her list of priorities. Perhaps someone had bought the workshop. bought it along with the tools. Perhaps someone was using them now to make doors and tables, and the tools, which were good tools, were continuing to do the work they had been designed to do.
This thought was partially comforting and partially devastating. But Edmund has also discovered something else in his cell, something that he had not expected. When you remove a man from the ability to make physical objects, when you take away all his tools and all his materials, when you strip away the external practice of his craft, sometimes the craft moves inward. It becomes interior. It becomes something that happens in the mind, in the imagination, in the specific way of thinking that is required to make things. Edmund has started to build things in his mind, not just remember them, actually build them, piece by piece, measurement by measurement.
He has decided to recreate, in the most detailed way possible, a door he once made. It was not the door for Sir Geoffrey. It was a door he made years ago for a merchant's house, a door that was beautiful but not ostentatious, that was made with care but not with the kind of excessive decoration that would call attention to itself. He has decided that in the hours when he is not moving, not thinking about his family, not arranging straw or scratching walls, he will build this door in his mind. He begins with the wood. He chooses it. He thinks about the grain of it, the color, the weight. He thinks about how the wood needs to be prepared, how it needs to be planed down, how the surface needs to be smooth.
He thinks about the boards that will make up the panels, and how they need to be selected so that the grain works in concert, so that the visual lines of the wood flow together in a way that is pleasing to the eye. He thinks about the frame that will hold the panels, and how the frame needs to be precisely measured so that the panels fit without being forced, but also without being loose. He thinks about the joinery, the specific way that one piece of wood is connected to another.
He thinks about mortise and tenon joints, how the mortise is cut into one piece of wood, and the tenon is cut from another piece of wood, and when they are joined together, they lock perfectly, without nails, without screws, without anything but the shape of the wood itself, talking to the shape of the other wood. This mental building takes him hours. He does not rush it. He thinks about each step, and he pictures it, and he watches, in his mind, as his hands do the work that they used to do. He imagines the sound of the tools, the sound of the saw cutting through wood, a rhythmic whisper, the sound of the chisel hitting the wood, a sharp, clear sound that means something is happening, that progress is being made.
The sound of the plane skimming across the surface, creating shavings that curl and fall. He imagines these sounds, and he thinks about how his hands would have felt the vibrations of the tools, and how his body would have known, from years of practice, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when the cut was deep enough, exactly when the surface was smooth enough. And then, once he has mentally built this door, once he has seen it in his mind in its completion, he starts over. He builds it again. He pays attention to different things. The second time, he pays attention to the wood grain, and he tries to remember, from his years of working, which grain patterns looked best together. The third time, he pays attention to the decorative elements, to the small carvings that would ornament the door. The fourth time, he pays attention to the finish, to how the wood would be sanded smooth, and how the stain would be applied, and how the final oil would bring out the color and protect the surface. He does this over and over. He has built this door in his mind more than 50 times now. Each time he learns something. Each time he remembers something that he had forgotten. Each time the door in his mind becomes more real, more detailed, more present. And the strange thing is that this does not feel like suffering. It does not feel like torture. It feels, in some quiet way, like work.
It feels like the continuation of something that he was always going to do, regardless of the circumstances. There is a man named Robert in the cell to your right. You do not know much about Robert. You have never spoken to him, but you know his breathing.
You know the sound his footsteps make when he paces, which he does often, back and forth, in a pattern that suggests he is thinking about something. You know that he coughs sometimes, a dry cough, not the wet cough of the man 3 cells down. You know that he sometimes talks to himself, not rehearsing conversations the way the other man does, but actually arguing with people. You can hear the anger in his voice. You do not know what Robert was imprisoned for.
You do not know how long his sentence is. You do not know if he is even still alive most of the time, but you know his sounds. One afternoon, though you are not certain it is afternoon because the dungeon does not differentiate between afternoon and morning and evening, but you think it is probably afternoon based on some internal sense of the day that you have developed, you hear Robert sit down hard against his cell wall. You hear him breathing heavily, and then you hear him start to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, but the sound of a man who is crying, the sound of a man who has come to some understanding, or who has given up some understanding, who has crossed some line and found that the other side of the line is somewhere he does not want to be. You do not know what to do. You do not know if you should acknowledge him, if you should remain silent, if you should try to comfort him. You have not spoken in so long that the idea of speaking seems foreign to you, seems like it would be crossing a boundary that you have set up inside yourself, and so you remain silent. But you do not ignore him. You listen. You hear him cry, and you hear him slowly calm down, and you hear him breathe himself back into control, and you think about how he is probably thinking the same things that you have thought many times. How is this bearable? Why is this happening? How long can the human mind continue in this state before it breaks? And somehow, listening to Robert, hearing another person suffering, brings you a kind of strange comfort. It is not that you are glad he is suffering. It is that you are not alone in suffering. There is someone else here, someone else who is trying to figure out how to exist in a place that is designed to make existence difficult.
There is someone else who is breathing the damp air and looking at the darkness and trying to make sense of a world that does not make sense. This is not comfort in any normal meaning of the word, but in the dungeon, normal meanings do not apply. In the dungeon, comfort is a kind of relative thing. But Edmund's story is not just about suffering. It is not just about the day-to-day degradation of a man in a cell. There is another part to this story, a part that involves creation in a different way. You see, Edmund has begun to build something else, something that exists not just in his mind, but also in the material world. Something that, if anyone were to discover it, would cause serious problems.
But Edmund has decided that some things are worth the risk. He has been collecting materials, small materials, pieces of straw that are different from other pieces of straw, thicker, thinner, stronger, bits of stone that have different textures, a sliver of wood that came to him, how he is not exactly sure, though he suspects it may have been brought in with one of the deliveries of food, a thread from the blanket that he has carefully pulled loose. He has begun to believe that they can be made into something. He is building a tiny house, not a house in any literal sense, not a house that anyone could live in. It is a house that is perhaps 6 inches tall, made of straw and stone and the single sliver of wood. It is built on the floor of his cell, in a corner where it is not immediately visible from the bars. It is built slowly, carefully, with an attention to detail that would be obsessive if it did not feel so necessary, so right. He is building it from memory. He is building a recreation of his own house, the house that he shared with Margaret, the house where his children grew up. He is making every detail as accurate as he can, given the materials available.
The door is made of the sliver of wood. The walls are made of carefully arranged straw, held together with moisture and pressure, the kind of adhesion that only works because of the specific conditions of the damp dungeon. The roof is made of stone,
flat pieces that he has shaped as well as he can with his hands and with a piece of stone that he scratches with. The house has windows. They are holes in the straw walls, but they are placed where the windows of his house had been, and they serve the purpose of being places where light could enter, or could have entered if there had been light.
The house has a chimney, made by standing a thin piece of straw upright, and it serves no purpose, and it does not work, but it is there, because a house needs a chimney, because the idea of a house includes the idea of a chimney, because Edmund's mind cannot let go of the details of completeness. It is difficult to say why he is doing this. It is difficult to articulate the purpose. If you had asked him, he might have said that he was trying to preserve something. He is trying to maintain a connection to the place he came from, to the life he lived before the dungeon. He is trying to build a record of his own existence, as if to say, I was here, I lived here.
I was a person in a house, with a family, with a wife, with children, with a life that had meaning and shape. The dungeon would like to make him forget this. The dungeon would like to erase this. Every day that passes, the dungeon is trying to convince him that the only life he has ever had is the life in the cell, that there is nothing before it and nothing after it, that this is all there is and all there ever was. By building the house, he is resisting this. He is saying, no. I remember. I remember the color of the door. I remember the location of the windows. I remember the smell of the interior. I remember sitting in the main room in the evening, with Margaret across from me, doing her needlework while I sat with my own thoughts.
I remember all of this, and it was real, and it matters, even though I am here, even though I am locked in a cell, even though I am slowly forgetting the exact sound of my wife's voice. The house is becoming a repository of memory. It is becoming a way of storing information that cannot be stored in a mind that is slowly being worn down by the repetition of the dungeon. It is becoming a proof of existence in the same way that scratches on a wall are a proof that time is passing, that something is happening, that there is a record of these things happening even if no one sees the record. There is a moment, perhaps 3 weeks after he began building the house, when he realizes that he is not just building a physical structure.
He is also building something inside himself. As his hands arrange the straw, as he shapes the stone, as he places the tiny pieces of his memory into the physical world, something is happening to the way he thinks about the dungeon. The dungeon is still the dungeon. The walls are still there. The darkness is still there. The guard still brings food. The bucket still needs to be emptied. The cold still penetrates his bones. But somehow, by creating something, he has created a boundary between himself and the dungeon. The dungeon is the dungeon, and he is Edmund, the man who makes things, even in a dungeon, even with materials that are barely materials at all.
This is a form of escape, though it is not the kind of escape that you might expect from the title of this story. It is not an escape that involves running from the castle. It is not an escape that involves breaking through walls or bribing guards or any of the dramatic methods that you might see in stories about escapes. It is an escape that happens in the mind. It is an escape that says, you can confine my body, but you cannot confine me entirely. There is a part of me that remains free, that remains capable of creation, that remains capable of maintaining a sense of self in the face of systems designed to erase that sense of self. Edmund does not know if this is a real escape or if it is just a kind of comfort story that he is telling himself. He does not know if the act of building the house is actually meaningful or if it is just a way of wasting time, a way of distracting himself from the fact that he is locked in a dungeon and there is no way out. But he continues to build. He continues to add details. He has now started to build tiny pieces of furniture inside the house. A bed made of straw and stone. A table made of compressed bits of material that he has gathered.
He is building a replica of his own life, inside a dungeon, with no audience, no one to see it, no one to appreciate it, except himself. Sometimes when he looks at the house, he thinks about the concept of scale. He thinks about how a real house is a place where people live, where they spend their lives, where they make memories, and this tiny house is a representation of that, reduced, compressed, made small enough to fit in the corner of a dungeon cell. And he wonders if this is what his entire life is, a representation of something larger, a reduction of something that was once full and rich and complex, now compressed and simplified to fit in the constraints of his circumstances. But he also thinks about how the tiny house, though it is small, though it is made of materials that have no intrinsic value, though it serves no practical purpose, is still real. It is still there. It takes up space. It has weight, even though the weight is negligible. It exists, and its existence is a statement. It is a statement that even in a place designed for non-existence, for the erasure of the individual, for the reduction of a human being to a number and a cell and a daily routine, there is the possibility of making something. There is the possibility of creation. There is the possibility of maintaining one's sense of self. Edmund has not always been the person he is now. This is important to understand.
Edmund has been shaped by his time in the dungeon, but he was already a person before the dungeon, and the person he was has something to do with how he is surviving the dungeon now. To understand Edmund, you need to understand the man he was before. Edmund's father had been a carpenter also. This is one of the common ways that skills pass through families, through the teaching and the watching and the doing. Edmund's father had taught him how to understand wood, how to see the potential in a raw piece of material, how to understand that wood is not inert, that wood has its own language, that wood is telling you something if you know how to listen. Edmund's father was not a gentle teacher. He was not the kind of father who told his son that he was doing well, or who encouraged him, or who offered comfort when Edmund made mistakes. Instead, Edmund's father believed in learning through failure. When Edmund was young, perhaps 12 or 13, his father gave him a piece of wood and asked him to make a cup. Not a difficult cup, a simple cup, cylindrical, something that a child could understand. Edmund spent a week on it. He was excited about it. He imagined how the cup would turn out. He imagined using it to drink water or giving it to his mother as a gift. He worked carefully, trying to remember everything that his father had taught him. The cup came out wrong. The walls were uneven. One side was thicker than the other. The bottom was not flat. The rim was jagged. The cup was barely usable. It was the kind of thing that a person might appreciate as the work of a child, but it was not a good cup. It was not a cup that anyone would actually want to drink from. Edmund's father looked at the cup for a long time. He did not say anything. He simply took the cup and he threw it against the wall, and it broke into pieces. Edmund cried. He was young enough that breaking something he had worked on seemed like the end of the world. His father told him that crying was a waste of time, that the cup was garbage, that Edmund had wasted his time and a piece of good wood, and that the world would be full of moments like this, where his work was not good enough, and he had to learn to live with that, to accept it, to use it as information about how to do better next time. Edmund did not appreciate this lesson at the time, but it stayed with him. It taught him something important, that work could fail, that the failure of work did not mean the failure of self, and that the only useful response to failure was to do the work again, to do it better, to pay attention to what had gone wrong, and to correct it. This lesson did not make Edmund happy as a child. But it made him into a craftsman as an adult. By the time he was an adult, he had learned to value the work over the product. He had learned to value the process of learning over the comfort of success. He had learned that the goal was not to make a perfect cup on the first try, but to become the kind of person who could make a perfect cup eventually, through repetition and attention and correction.
So when Edmund found himself in the dungeon, something in his training helped him. Not consciously. He was not thinking about his father's teaching while he was in the cell. But his father had taught him something about how to survive difficulty. He had taught him that suffering was information.
He had taught him that the human capacity to adapt is vast, that the human capacity to accept what cannot be changed is even larger, that the human capacity to continue, even in the face of things that should break a person, is something that exists in all of us if we are trained correctly. Edmund's first months in the dungeon had been harder than his later months. The first months had involved more resistance, more anger, more of the kind of despair that comes from the sudden loss of freedom. But as time went on, something shifted. He realized that the dungeon was, in a strange way, a kind of training. It was training him. It was teaching him things, just as his father had trained him, by making him remake the cup, by making him understand that failure was not a tragedy but a teacher. The dungeon was making him understand what he could live without. It was making him understand that the essential parts of himself were not dependent on external circumstances. It was making him understand that the person he was, the person who made things, the person who created, the person who understood the language of materials, that person could exist even in a dungeon. This is not to say that the dungeon is a good teacher. It is not. A dungeon teaches through cruelty and deprivation and the constant pressing down of the self. But it teaches, nonetheless.
And Edmund, because of his training, because of his father's harsh lessons, was perhaps better prepared to learn from a dungeon than someone else might have been. In the 7th month of his imprisonment, Edmund begins to think about what he will do when he is released, if he is released. The probability of his release seems small to him. He has been sentenced to 5 years, which is a long time, and people die in dungeons for lesser crimes than his. But he allows himself, in the quiet moments, to imagine it. He allows himself to think about what it would be like to step out into sunlight, to breathe air that comes from the outside, to see his wife, to see his children, who will be grown enough that he might not recognize them.
He wonders if he will be able to do his work again. He wonders if his hands, which have done almost nothing for 7 months, will remember how to hold a tool. He wonders if his back, which aches constantly now, will be able to support the kind of physical work that carpentry requires. He wonders if his mind, which has become used to the slow pace of the dungeon, will be able to speed up again, to engage with the outside world at the pace that the outside world requires. But more than that, he wonders if he will want to. He wonders if, after the dungeon, after learning what he has learned, after being trained in the way the dungeon trains, if he will even want to go back to the simple work of making doors and tables.
He wonders if he has been changed permanently, if the dungeon has done something to him that cannot be undone. He does not have answers to these questions, but he knows, with a certainty that he cannot explain, that if he does get out of the dungeon, if he does get released, he will go back to the work. He will remake the doors. He will rebuild the tables. He will return to the language of wood, the language that his father taught him, because that is what the dungeon has taught him, that the self is not dependent on circumstances, but the self is also not static. The self is the thing that you do, again and again, the thing that you make, the thing that you continue to make, even when it would be easier to give up.
But let us not pretend that the dungeon is easy. Let us not pretend that the mind can overcome the body, that the spiritual can overcome the physical, that the will can overcome the slow deterioration that comes with being locked in a cell for months. The dungeon is hard. It is hard in ways that are difficult to articulate, in ways that do not fit into neat narratives of survival or triumph. Your teeth are beginning to fail. You do not know why. Perhaps it is the diet. Perhaps it is the damp. Perhaps it is simply the passing of time, the body slowly falling apart in the way that bodies do. But you have noticed that one of your teeth, a tooth on the left side of your mouth, has begun to feel loose.
You notice it because your tongue keeps finding it, pressing against it, testing whether it will stay in place. You notice it because sometimes when you eat the porridge, it hurts. The pain is not severe. It is a low, persistent pain, the kind that does not disable you, but that makes you aware, constantly, that something is wrong with you. You do not know what will happen to this tooth. You do not know if it will eventually fall out, or if it will simply hurt forever, or if it will somehow fix itself. But you know that in the outside world, there would be a dentist. In the outside world, there would be options.
In the dungeon, there is only time, and the hope that time will resolve the problem one way or another. Your back is worse. The stone bench that you sit on during the day is not kind to the human spine. The straw that you sleep on is thin, and the cold of the stone floor underneath bleeds through it. You have developed a pain in your lower back that is always present. You notice it when you wake up. You notice it when you sit. You notice it when you try to stand. The pain creates a kind of posture, a way of holding your body that might eventually become permanent. Your father had back pain in the last years of his life. Edmund remembers this.
He remembers his father moving stiffly, moving as if his spine was made of wood instead of bone and cartilage. He remembers his father grimacing when he thought no one was looking. He wonders if this is how it starts. He wonders if the pain in his back is the beginning of a lifelong condition that will follow him out of the dungeon and into whatever comes after. He does try to exercise. He tries to walk the length of his cell, to engage his legs, to keep his muscles from atrophying completely. But the cell is small, and the walking is repetitive, and the space is confining enough that the exercise becomes in itself a kind of mild torture. You walk forward, you are stopped by the wall. You turn around, you walk backward.
You are stopped by the bars. You turn around again. Forward, backward, forward, backward. After 100 iterations of this, the exercise becomes something else. It becomes a meditation, perhaps, or a ritual. But it also becomes a kind of acknowledgement of the confines of the space. Each step is a negotiation with walls that will not move, bars that will not open, a sentence that will not shorten, regardless of how much you walk. There is also the question of disease. The dungeon is damp, and the damp brings mold. You can see it on the walls sometimes, a kind of dark growth that indicates decay, that indicates the slow working of entropy on the stone. You can smell it in the air. You can feel it in your lungs.
Breathing in the dungeon is different than breathing in the outside world. Each breath is slightly thicker. Each breath brings in moisture that your lungs have to process. Over time, this has an effect. You notice that you tire more easily. You notice that your breath comes shorter. You notice that sometimes when you lie down at night, your breathing sounds rattling. Sounds like there is something wrong with the mechanism of respiration itself. There is a man in the cell below you. You know this because sometimes you can hear sounds from below, sounds that suggest there is another level to the dungeon, that the dungeon goes deeper than you had realized. You do not know who this man is. You do not know anything about him.
But sometimes you hear him coughing, a long, wet cough that suggests disease, that suggests the kind of respiratory infection that the dungeon creates. The cough goes on and on. Sometimes it continues for hours. You listen to it, and you think about how the dungeon is slowly killing the man below you, and you think about how the dungeon is probably slowly killing you too, just more slowly, just in ways that are less obvious. Sleep becomes difficult. In the early days, exhaustion would overcome you, and you would sleep deeply, the sleep of someone whose body has been pushed beyond its limits. But as time goes on, the sleep becomes lighter, becomes disrupted.
You sleep for a few hours, and then you wake, and you lie in the dark, and you think about the hours until morning, and you try to sleep again, and you succeed partially, and then you wake again. The sleep of the dungeon is not restful. It is a kind of repeated surrender that never quite manages to be complete.
You wake with aches that were not there when you fell asleep. You wake with dreams that you cannot quite remember, but that leave you feeling unsettled. You wake to sounds, the cough of the man below, the breathing of the other prisoners, the movement of rats in the walls, the sound of water somewhere in the darkness. And these sounds become part of your reality, and you never fully escape them. There is also hunger.
Not the hunger that kills you quickly, but the slow hunger that comes from a diet that is never quite enough. The porridge fills your stomach, but it does not nourish you in the way that proper food would. You can feel the lack in your body. You can feel that something is missing. Your muscles are becoming smaller. Your face is becoming thinner. You can feel this when you press your hands against your face, when you feel the bones more prominently than before. Your body is slowly consuming itself, and you are aware of this, and you are powerless to stop it. But you continue. This is the strange thing about the human body, about the human will, about the human capacity to persist.
Even as the body is deteriorating, even as disease is settling into the lungs, even as hunger is slowly consuming you, you continue. You wake up, you eat the porridge, you work on the house in the corner of your cell, you scratch marks on the wall, you build the door in your mind. You continue. Not because things are getting better, not because you believe that the dungeon will release you, not because of hope in any conventional sense, but because continuing is what a person does. Continuing is what a body does. It is the default state of the human organism, the tendency toward life, the ability to keep going even when the reasons to keep going have been exhausted. This is not noble. This is not heroic.
This is simply what happens when a person is placed in circumstances that do not allow for the option of stopping. The body continues because the alternative is death, and the body is programmed to avoid death, even when death might be preferable to the alternative of continuing in a dungeon. Edmund, before the dungeon, had a place in the community. He was the carpenter. He was the man you went to if you needed a door made or a table or a window frame. He was the man whose skill was recognized, whose work was valued, whose opinion on matters of craft and quality was respected. He was not wealthy, but he was not poor. He was not powerful, but he was not powerless. He had a niche in the social order of the town, a role that was understood and respected. In the dungeon, Edmund has no such role. The dungeon is a place where all roles are stripped away. You are not a carpenter. You are not a husband. You are not a father. You are not a member of the community. You are a prisoner. That is your role. That is your identity as far as the dungeon is concerned. You are defined by the fact that you have committed a crime, or in Edmund's case, a crime of insolence, and you are here as punishment. That is all you are. That is all you are allowed to be. This is a kind of modern bridge in a way. In the contemporary world, we also define people by their roles.
We ask people when we meet them what they do for work. We define ourselves by our professions, our positions, our places in the social hierarchy. We say, I am a lawyer, I am a teacher, I am a doctor, I am a cashier. And in those identifications, we are also saying something about our value, our place, our worth. Remove a person from their role, and something fundamental shifts. This is why unemployment is not just about the loss of income. It is about the loss of identity, the loss of place, the loss of the answer to the question, what do you do? When you are in a dungeon, the answer to that question is, you are imprisoned. That is what you do. That is all you are.
But Edmund has found a way to maintain his role even in the dungeon, or at least to maintain some version of it. He is still making things, not with the tools he once used, not with the materials he once used, but with the materials available to him. He is still engaging in the work of creation, still using the skills that his father taught him, still participating in the essential aspect of his identity that has nothing to do with his place in the social order. This is a subtle thing, easy to overlook, but it is important.
By continuing to make things, by building the house, by constructing the door in his mind, Edmund is maintaining a sense of self that exists outside of the dungeon's authority.
The dungeon can strip him of his profession. The dungeon can prevent him from being a carpenter in any material sense. But the dungeon cannot prevent him from thinking like a carpenter, from approaching problems the way a carpenter approaches them, from being, in some fundamental way, the kind of person who makes things. Among the other prisoners, Edmund has become a kind of figure, not a leader exactly, though leadership would require communication, and Edmund has chosen silence, but a presence, a witness, a person who continues to exist in the dungeon in a way that is particular and persistent. The man in the cell 3 doors down, the man with the wet cough, has noticed Edmund.
He has noticed that Edmund seems somehow different from the other prisoners. He has noticed that Edmund does not rail against his fate. He does not curse the guards. He does not attempt desperate escape plans that everyone knows will fail. He simply exists. He accepts. He continues. The man with the wet cough has drawn some comfort from this, though he does not understand why. There is something in Edmund's acceptance that seems to suggest that it is possible to exist in the dungeon without being destroyed by it, that there is a way to be a human being in a place designed to reduce human beings to less than human. Similarly, the man who talks to himself, the man who rehearses conversations he will never have, has noticed Edmund.
He has noticed the small movements, the careful rearrangement of straw, the scratching of marks on the wall. He has noticed that Edmund is doing something, that there is a project, that there is work, and this has affected the way he thinks about his own situation. If Edmund can make something of the dungeon, if Edmund can find a way to create meaning in a place that is designed to strip meaning away, perhaps he can do it too. The man with the wet cough dies eventually, on a night that is indistinguishable from any other night, and no one particularly notices that he is gone until several meals have been left uneaten in his cell. But before he dies, before his death becomes inevitable, his final months are slightly less terrible because he has witnessed Edmund's persistence. The guard, Gilbert, has also noticed something. Gilbert is a man who has been doing his job for 30 years without thinking about it, without engaging with the prisoners as human beings, without allowing the work to affect him. But Edmund's silence, Edmund's particular way of being in the dungeon, has somehow penetrated the wall that Gilbert has built around himself. Gilbert brings the food, he removes the buckets, he performs his routine. But sometimes, when he is removing the bucket from Edmund's cell, Gilbert notices the arrangements of straw on the floor.
Gilbert notices the marks on the wall. Gilbert does not comment on them. Gilbert does not acknowledge them, but Gilbert sees them. And seeing them, Gilbert is forced to confront the fact that the prisoners are not just objects moving within the dungeon, they are people. They are people with projects, with desires, with some kind of continuing sense of meaning, even in a place where meaning is supposed to be impossible. This affects Gilbert in subtle ways. It does not change his job. It does not change what he does, but it changes the way he feels about the job. It makes the job less comfortable, in a way. It makes it harder to ignore the implications of the work that he does.
It makes it harder to pretend that the dungeon is just a place, that the prisoners are just objects, that the work has no moral weight. Edmund, by continuing to be human in a place designed to strip away humanity, by continuing to create meaning in a place designed to eliminate meaning, has changed the internal experience of Gilbert and possibly changed it permanently. This is the strange power of persistent humanity. Edmund is not plotting escape. Edmund is not attempting rebellion. Edmund is not trying to do anything that would be considered threatening by any normal standard.
But by simply continuing to be himself, by maintaining his essential nature in the face of systems designed to destroy that nature, Edmund is somehow participating in an act of resistance. It is a very quiet resistance. It is a resistance that does not make noise, but it is powerful nonetheless. The days continue. The weeks continue. The months continue. Edmund continues. Time passes in the dungeon the way time passes everywhere, though it passes more slowly, though it seems to weigh more, though each unit of time seems to contain more of itself. Edmund has now been in the dungeon for more than a year. He has crossed the 1-year mark, and in doing so he has crossed some kind of threshold.
The first year felt impossible when he looked forward to it. The first year felt like a sentence that was unimaginably long. And yet he has survived the first year. He continues to survive. The small house in the corner of his cell is now very detailed. It has furniture. It has the approximation of decorations. It has reached a point where Edmund has stopped adding to it in significant ways. The work of building is largely complete. What remains is maintenance, the careful preservation of a structure made from materials that want to decay, that want to return to their original state of nothingness. Edmund spends time, now, simply maintaining the house. He checks the walls. He reinforces the straw that is starting to come loose.
He ensures that the stone roof does not collapse. This work is meditative. It is the work of a man who has learned to live with the acceptance that creation is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process, that once something is made, it requires constant care to continue existing. The door that Edmund has been building in his mind is now very complete. He has thought about it so many times that every detail is clear. He has built it not just once, but many hundreds of times, and each time he has learned something, remembered something, refined something. If he were to leave the dungeon tomorrow, he could build this door, could build it from memory, could create it in the material world without any reference other than what is stored in his mind. This is in itself a kind of victory. It is a victory over the dungeon, because the dungeon cannot take away what is stored in the mind. The dungeon can take away his tools. The dungeon can take away his materials. The dungeon can take away his freedom. But the dungeon cannot take away the knowledge of how to make a door. The dungeon cannot take away the memory of craft. Slowly, the evening of the dungeon begins.
The evening of a dungeon is not much different from the morning or the afternoon, but Edmund has learned to think of the day in sections, has learned to mark the passing of time with these different sections, as if by giving them names, he can create the structure that the dungeon refuses to provide. The evening is when Edmund stops moving around his cell as much. It is when he sits on the bench and reflects on the day, though the day is largely indistinguishable from every other day. It is when he thinks about the time that has passed and the time that remains. He thinks about his wife. Margaret is now managing a household on almost no income. The dowry that she brought to the marriage has been mostly spent.
Their house, though it is theirs, is a constant reminder of the person who should be there and is not. Edmund wonders if she has begun to consider the idea of remarrying. He wonders if, from her perspective, Edmund is effectively dead already. A man who was alive is now gone, and the body of the man she married is locked away in a dungeon where it will likely remain. And at what point does a wife begin to think of herself as a widow, not because her husband has actually died, but because her husband has become inaccessible in a way that is, functionally, equivalent to death? He tries not to think about this, but the thought comes to him, unbidden, and once it comes, it is hard to push away.
He thinks about the idea that Margaret might move on, that Margaret might find another man, might have another husband, might be building a new life without him. Part of him thinks that this would be good. He thinks that Margaret deserves happiness, that Margaret deserves to live a full life, that his presence in the dungeon should not mean the end of her life. But another part of him thinks that if Margaret moves on, then the Edmund he was, the Edmund who was husband, who was father, who was a specific person in the lives of specific people, that Edmund will become truly dead.
The body will continue to exist in the dungeon, but the role, the place, the identity will be gone, will be replaced by another man, and Edmund will fade into the past, becoming a story that Margaret tells to her new husband, becoming a ghost in her own history. He does not want this, but he also accepts it. He has learned, in the dungeon, to accept things that he does not want. This is perhaps the cruelest teaching of the dungeon, the teaching that wanting something does not make it true, does not change circumstances, does not alter the world. What is what is. The dungeon has taught him this over and over, every single day. What is what is, and your wanting it to be different does not matter. His children.
His son would be 9 years old now, perhaps even approaching 10. His daughter would be 6, almost 7. He tries to imagine them. He tries to imagine what they look like, whether they remember him, whether they ask about him. He imagines his wife trying to explain where he is, why he does not come home. What would a mother say to a child about a father who has been imprisoned unjustly, who is locked away in a dungeon for a crime that is, in the eyes of the child, inexplicable? How would you explain insolence to a 6-year-old? How would you explain the concept of nobility, the concept of social hierarchy, the concept that some people can harm other people without consequence, and that other people are trapped by these systems, locked into them, unable to escape? Edmund thinks about his daughter. He thinks about whether she has forgotten his face. He thinks about whether, if he were released tomorrow, she would recognize him. He thinks about the specific pain of a parent reuniting with a child who does not remember them, who has grown beyond the relationship, who has created a new self that has no space in it for the father who was not there during the crucial years of becoming. But alongside this pain is something else.
There is also the knowledge that he cannot change these things. He cannot make his daughter remember him from inside the dungeon. He cannot create a relationship with his son by wishing for it. He cannot be a father by wanting to be a father. What he can do is continue. What he can do is survive. What he can do is ensure that if he is ever released, if he is ever given another chance at life, that he will be there, that he will be present, that he will try, even though everything will be strange and wrong and different from what he imagined. The light in the dungeon fades further in the evening, not because there is external light that comes and goes, but because Edmund's perception of light changes with the time of day.
His body has adapted to the rhythms of the dungeon, has created an internal sense of time that is not based on external markers, but on the cycling of his own fatigue, his own hunger, his own body's needs. In the evening, this cycle tells him that it is time for rest. In the evening, even though the dungeon is always dark, Edmund perceives it as more dark, as if his brain is creating darkness to match the expected pattern of day and night. This is a ritual.
This is the kind of action that signals the end of work, that signals a completion, that allows the mind to let go of the day and begin to prepare for sleep. His father taught him this too, in a way. His father always took the last few minutes of the evening to clean his tools, to put them in order, to prepare them for the next day's work. Edmund had absorbed this practice, had made it part of his own rhythm, and now in the dungeon, without tools to clean, he cleanses the stone, and it serves the same purpose. It is an acknowledgement. It is a transition. It is a way of saying, today is done. Tomorrow is not yet here, but sleep is coming. He lies down on the straw. The straw is old now.
It has been compressed by months of his body lying on it. The shape of him has become embedded in the straw. It is not comfortable, but it is his in a way. He lies down and pulls the moldy blanket over himself. He thinks about the ritual of settling down, the ritual of the body preparing for rest. He thinks about how even in the dungeon, even in the darkness, even in the confinement and the cold, this ritual of sleep still happens, still functions, still allows the body to rest and recover. And in this space, in this evening space, in this moment of transition between the chaos of the day and the rest of the night, Edmund thinks about what escape really is. He thinks about the title of the story, about the promise that it contains.
You won't believe how he escaped the castle dungeons. And he understands now what the escape was. It was not a physical escape.
It was not breaking through walls or bribing guards or waiting for an opportunity to run. The escape was the slow daily work of maintaining the self in the face of a system designed to destroy the self. The escape was the decision to continue making things, to continue creating, to continue being a person with agency and intention and the ability to affect the world, even if that world was limited to a 6 by 8 foot cell.
The escape was understanding that the dungeon could confine the body, but that the dungeon could not confine the mind, could not confine the ability to think, could not confine the essential quality of the self that was Edmund. The escape was the small house in the corner of the cell, the marks on the wall, the door constructed in the mind. The escape was the refusal to let the dungeon define him entirely, the refusal to accept that the dungeon was all there was. And so, like the prisoner after a long day, after months of days, after a year of days, after perhaps years of days that will continue to come, Edmund rests, his body settles, his mind begins to let go.
The dungeon continues around him, the darkness and the damp and the weight of the stone and the cold. But Edmund, inside this space, inside this body, inside this continuing consciousness, Edmund finds a kind of peace. Not the peace of being free, not the peace of being released, not the peace of having won or escaped or overcome, but the peace of acceptance, the peace of continuation, the peace of knowing that he is still here, still himself, still capable of creation and intention and meaning, even in a place designed to strip all of these things away. And as Edmund drifts toward sleep, as his consciousness begins to fade, as the work of the day concludes and the rest of the night begins, you too can follow.
You can feel your own body settling, your own mind beginning to let go. You have traveled through Edmund's day, through his experience, through his slow work of survival and creation. You have been with him in the dungeon, and you have learned something, perhaps, about the capacity of the human mind and body to persist, to adapt, to find meaning even in the darkest circumstances. And so, like Edmund after a long day in the dungeon, like the craftsman after hours of work, like the human being after the full weight of existence has been carried through another day, you too can rest now. You can let your body be heavy on the surface that supports it. You can let your breathing become slow and deep. You can let the thoughts that have been moving through your mind begin to settle and fade. You can allow yourself the rest that your body needs, the sleep that will repair and restore you, the peace that comes from letting go of the day and allowing the night to do its work. The dungeon continues. Edmund continues. History continues its gentle rhythm, indifferent to the lives it contains, moving forward in its slow way, carrying people with it, leaving some behind, lifting others up, and always, always continuing. And you, knowing this, knowing that history will continue with or without your vigilance, knowing that the world will continue even while you sleep, can finally let yourself rest.
Can finally allow yourself to be heavy, to be tired, to be done with the day, to be ready for sleep. And so you rest now, and Edmund rests, and the dungeon rests around him, dark and cold and permanent. Sleep well.